Hi, thank you so much for being here. I've written this story and I took inspiration from something in real life. Like, obviously, it's a fictional story, but it always comes from a real place, if that makes sense. Let's jump into it.
My 5-year-old needed to be taken to the hospital. My dad said, "Children are not allowed in my car." My mom shrugged. "Just figure it out." Then my wealthy aunt got up and did this. My parents went white. I was on the side patio of my parents' house, close enough to hear teaspoons touch china through the open dining room window, when my daughter Sylvie stopped mid-sentence and pressed her hand to the center of her chest. She was 5, small for her age, and usually loud in a way that made silence stand out fast. A minute earlier, she had been drawing a crooked rainbow with sidewalk chalk. Now she looked at me without speaking, shoulders lifting too high with each breath. I knew that pattern because our pediatrician had shown me exactly what to watch for. The pause before the cough, the tight little swallow, the skin pulling between the ribs. "Mama," she said, and even that one word came out thin. I dropped to my knees, wiped the chalk dust off her fingers, and put my hand on her back. Her breathing was fast, but not the loose, crying kind. It had that dry, trapped sound I had learned to respect. Inside, I could hear my mother laugh at something in her bright company voice. Outside, my daughter's lips were still pink, but her chest was working too hard. The afternoon split cleanly in half right there. Something had started. I pulled Sylvie's rescue inhaler from my tote, snapped the spacer into place, and had her sit on the patio step because standing made her fight for air. "2 slow breaths for me," I said. "Then the medicine." She tried to nod. I gave her the first puff, counted the breaths, then the second, watching the rise of her chest the whole time. Usually, if we caught things early, I could feel the change within a minute or two. Her shoulders would drop. The cough would loosen. She would get annoyed at me for hovering and ask for juice. That day, nothing softened. She took the medicine and still leaned forward with her mouth open, trying to pull air deeper than it wanted to go. I checked the clock on my phone, because when you have a child with asthma, you learn to turn panic into steps. 2 puffs. Wait. Watch. If the wheeze stays sharp, if the work of breathing doesn't settle, do not wait to see whether it becomes dramatic enough for other people to believe you. "We're going now," I told her, scooping up the inhaler and her little cardigan. I didn't say hospital yet. She heard it anyway. Her fingers grabbed my shirt collar and held on. There was no more watching. My own car was unavailable, which was the one detail that turned urgency into a trap. The radiator had gone 2 days earlier, and the mechanic kept telling me the replacement part was coming in tomorrow, which is what people say when they know you don't have leverage. I had been borrowing rides and keeping our movements small until the repair was done. That afternoon, I had agreed to stay out of the house while my parents entertained my Aunt Claudia because my mother had made it sound like a military instruction instead of a family request. "Do not interrupt us," she had said, before carrying out the good teacups she only used for people she wanted something from. So when I lifted Sylvie into my arms and felt how tight her body had gone, I knew exactly which rule I was about to break. Her cheek was hot against my neck. My tote banged against my hip as I pushed through the side door with my shoulder. I didn't stop to smooth my shirt or lower my voice. The hallway smelled like lemon polish and the expensive candle my mother lit when she wanted the house to feel above its real life. Sylvie coughed once, hard. I headed straight for the dining room. I broke the rule anyway. My parents were seated at the table as if the afternoon had been built for appearance and nothing else. My father sat at the head in a pressed blue shirt, one hand beside his cup, the other resting near the keys to the car he washed more often than he called his granddaughter. My mother had the silver stand of little cakes in front of her and the attentive, sharpened expression she used when performing civility. Across from them sat my Aunt Claudia, my mother's sister, in a cream jacket with one pearl earring catching the light when she turned her head. I had seen her in person maybe 4 or 5 times in my adult life. She was the wealthy relative people lowered their voices around. The moment I stepped in with Sylvie on my hip, my mother's face tightened like I had brought mud across a white rug. "Liana," she said, not standing. "We asked for 1 quiet hour." My father glanced at Sylvie and then at the open door behind me, already irritated by motion. Claudia's eyes moved from my face to Sylvie's breathing and stayed there. No one reached for a phone. No one asked what happened. The first thing treated as urgent in that room was my interruption. It told me everything. I didn't waste words because there was no room for them. "Sylvie's having an asthma flare," I said. "I gave her the rescue inhaler. It isn't settling fast enough, and her pediatrician said if that happens, I take her to the ER right away." I said it clearly and in order, the way I had learned to speak to adults who liked to poke holes in panic. Sylvie had tucked her face into my shoulder, but I could feel the strain in every breath. I shifted her higher and faced my father because his car keys were right there in front of him, and Sylvie's travel booster was folded in the downstairs room off the laundry area beside our bags. My mother made a tiny sound in her throat that was halfway between annoyance and disbelief. "Did you even wait?" she asked. "You always jump straight to worst case." "I did wait," I said. "I did exactly what the doctor told me to do." My father leaned back and looked at me the way he looked at salespeople who stayed too long at the door. Claudia still hadn't spoken. She had set down her teacup very carefully, but that was all. I remember thinking that I had explained the emergency in language so plain a stranger at a bus stop would have moved already. I made it impossible to misunderstand. My father's first response was not concern. It was fatigue, the kind performed by people who want credit for tolerating you. "Not again," he said, dragging the words out as if I had chosen the timing to embarrass him. My mother nodded before I could answer. "Last time she was fine," she said. "We spent all evening rearranging everything, and it turned out to be nothing." Last time had been a 3-hour urgent care visit with a breathing treatment and a steroid prescription, but in their retelling, the only hardship that counted was inconvenience to them. "She is not fine now," I said. Sylvie gave a tight cough against my collarbone, a sound too harsh to ignore unless ignoring was the point. My mother winced, not with worry, but because it cut through her curated afternoon. "At least take her into the other room," she murmured, glancing at Claudia, as though the rude thing here was audible distress. My father picked up his napkin and smoothed it over one knee. The composure of that gesture made something cold settle in me. They weren't scared. They were irritated that the emergency had arrived in front of a witness. That difference mattered. I moved closer to the table. "Then drive us," I said. "Or give me the keys and I'll drive us myself." I was close enough to see the reflection of the chandelier in the polished wood and the faint mark where my father had placed his cup. My request could not have been simpler. He didn't even look at Sylvie when he answered. He put 2 fingers over the keys, like a man protecting property, and said in the same calm tone someone might use for a parking policy, "Children are not allowed in my car." For one second, I honestly thought I had misheard him because the sentence was so wildly out of proportion to the moment. Even Sylvie looked at him, confused by it. "She needs the hospital," I said. "Then call someone else." He said it with a small shrug. almost bored, as though I were asking for a favor that conflicted with his upholstery. I looked at my mother, expecting some last-minute correction, some embarrassed human reflex. She only pressed her lips together, then reached for the teapot as if conversation should continue. Sylvie's breathing rasped against my neck. My father had turned my child into a rule violation. He said it as if it were a standing policy, not a sentence about a child who needed the hospital. My mother poured more tea into Claudia's cup with a hand that did not shake, as if this were still an ordinary afternoon. "Just figure it out," she said. No softness, no apology, not even the pretend version people use when they want to seem blameless later. She might as well have told me to handle a dead battery or a grocery spill. She never once looked at Sylvie's face. I stood there holding my daughter, and for one thin second the room went silent except for Sylvie's breathing and the small clink of porcelain. Claudia had not defended me yet. She hadn't echoed them either. Her face stayed almost unreadable, as if she were taking the full measure of what she was hearing, which somehow made it worse. I had been warned for years that she disliked children, disliked mess, disliked weakness, disliked women who had not organized their lives into clean, expensive lines. So while my mother told me to solve an emergency without them, I could feel a second humiliation landing on top of the first. This was happening in front of the one person they had spent all week calling important. I remember looking at Claudia's hands, at the ring on her finger, at how still she was, and thinking that if she agreed with them, then I was truly alone in that room. Silence can be a verdict when the wrong people control it. That silence was worse. Anger and fear don't feel dramatic when they hit together. They make you very practical very fast. I shifted Sylvie to my other arm, reached into my pocket for my phone, and saw one bar of service because my parents' house sat in a dead zone at the edge of the neighborhood. My rideshare app spun uselessly. I had my thumb over 911, but Sylvie was still speaking in short phrases, and the pediatric ER was less than 10 minutes away if someone would just hand me a set of keys. My nearest friend was 20 minutes away on a good day. My mother saw me checking and said, "Please don't create a scene." A scene. My daughter pulled back enough for me to see her face, and the look she gave me was not panic yet. It was trust. That was the part that steadied me. "You're okay," I told her, though what I meant was I am moving, with or without them. My father slid his chair back an inch, annoyed by the tension he himself had made. Then, unbelievably, he asked my mother whether Claudia wanted more lemon. The two of them were already trying to resume the performance, to treat me as an unfortunate interruption who would remove herself if not fed more attention. It was the smoothness of that pivot that turned my stomach. They expected me to leave with my child still struggling for breath and somehow preserve their afternoon on the way out. They expected me to disappear quietly. Then Claudia stood up. She didn't push back her chair hard or raise her voice or do anything theatrical. She simply unfolded to her full height, set her napkin beside her plate, and looked first at Sylvie, then at me, then at my parents with a calm so complete it changed the air. "Liana," she said, and it startled me because it was the first time I had heard her say my name without one of my parents standing between us. "Bring your bag." That was all she said to me. To my parents, she said something lower, so controlled I only caught the final 2 words. "Understood clearly." I didn't know what those words were, but I saw what they did. My mother's face lost color so fast it looked as if someone had wiped it away. My father stood halfway, then sat back down, suddenly unsure of the floor under him. Claudia picked up a set of keys from her own chair and held the front door open with one hand. "Now," she said. I went. I caught up our bag and Sylvie's folding booster from beside the daybed as I passed the downstairs room. Claudia was already halfway across the driveway, assuming I had sense. And that was the moment the balance of power shifted. To understand why we were even in my parents' house that afternoon, you have to go back a few weeks. Before any of that happened, Sylvie and I had a life that was small, busy, and ours. We rented the upstairs half of a duplex across town, and it wasn't fancy, but I knew which stair creaked, which kitchen drawer jammed, and exactly how long it took late afternoon light to reach the little table where Sylvie liked to color while I paid bills. Then a pipe burst behind the bathroom wall. At first it looked manageable. One damp patch, a musty smell, a fan running in the hall. Within 2 days, the contractor had opened half the wall and found more damage than anyone wanted to admit. Wet insulation, dark streaks, old wood that had gone soft. He stood in my doorway in a paper mask and said, "You cannot have a child sleeping in here while we do remediation." He didn't need to say more. By evening, there were dehumidifiers roaring, plastic sheeting over the bathroom entrance, and a line of gray dust already collecting where Sylvie kept her bath toys. I packed clothes into laundry baskets while she asked whether we were having an adventure. "A temporary one," I told her. The only thing I knew for sure was that we could not stay there. Home stopped being usable in a single week. I tried every version of a backup plan before I called my parents. I priced extended stay motels, then closed the browser when I saw what a single week would cost. I called my landlord, who said insurance would probably reimburse some of it later, which is a sentence designed to be useless in the present. I took Sylvie to her pediatrician for a refill on her inhaler and mentioned the construction dust. The doctor listened to her lungs, looked at the notes from her last flare, and said, "If you can keep her away from dust, fumes, and constant disruption for a few weeks, do it." She said it gently, as if she knew "do it" can mean find money that does not exist. Hotels meant eating out, laundromats, bad sleep, and air systems I couldn't control. Friends offered couches for a night or two, but not the stretch of unstable weeks the repairs were going to take. My parents had a large house, 2 guest rooms, and the family habit of talking about family obligation when it made them look generous. So I called my mother from the clinic parking lot and explained the situation while Sylvie swung her shoes against the booster seat. My mother sighed before she answered yes. There really wasn't another option. When we arrived at my parents' house with 2 suitcases, a laundry basket, Sylvie's medication bag, and the exhausted optimism people carry when they need help badly enough to pretend help will be warm, my mother did not say, "Come in, get settled." She stood in the foyer, looked at the bags, and asked, "How long is this supposed to be?" I gave her the repair estimate. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if they found more damage, and she repeated it back in a tone usually reserved for bad weather. My father came from the den, took in the scene, and said, "We're not rearranging the whole house." Nobody had asked them to. I remember shifting one suitcase out of the way so Sylvie could lean against my leg while adults discussed her as if she were part of the luggage. My mother said the upstairs guest room was too full right now, meaning full of decorative storage she did not want to move, so she led us to a narrow downstairs room off the laundry area. It had a daybed, a standing lamp, and the smell of sealed fabric. Sylvie smiled anyway and said, "It's like camping." My mother corrected her, "No, sweetheart, it's temporary." She wanted the hierarchy established immediately. We were inside, but barely. The room we were given had no closet, 1 window facing the side fence, and just enough floor space for Sylvie to line up 3 stuffed animals before I had to move them so we could open the door. My mother set out rules before I had finished unzipping our first bag. No toys in shared spaces. No television before 9 a.m. Don't use the good towels. Try not to cook after 7 because your father doesn't like kitchen smells. If Sylvie coughed at night, shut the door so it doesn't wake the house. My father added that he worked best with quiet mornings, although he had been retired for 6 years. The first night, Sylvie whispered, "Why are we talking so soft?" And I told her Grandma and Grandpa liked calm. What I meant was that I had already understood the terms. We were not guests to be cared for, we were disruption to be managed. The next day, my mother moved our cereal to the lowest pantry shelf behind a basket of cloth napkins, as if visible evidence of us made the kitchen less elegant. Sylvie started asking permission to get water. I started carrying our things in a tote from room to room so no trace of us would spread. We learned to stay out of sight. The atmosphere sharpened the week my Aunt Claudia's visit became imminent. Until then, my parents had been merely cold. After her name entered the schedule, they turned strategic. My mother had the silver polished twice. My father took the car for detailing, even though no one had asked him to pick Claudia up from anywhere. I heard them in the kitchen late one evening when they thought the laundry room fan covered voices. "We need this to go well," my mother said. "Absolutely no chaos." My father answered, "She notices everything." That much I knew. What I did not fully understand until then was how much of their comfort depended on her goodwill. Claudia was my mother's older sister, the one who had built money, owned property, and had the kind of connections my parents spoke about as if proximity alone made them accomplished. I also learned, in fragments they didn't realize I could hear, that she had been helping them more directly than they admitted, covering costs here and there, funding the lease on the car my father babied, bridging temporary gaps that never seemed to end. Their house suddenly looked different to me, not like proof of their success, but like a stage kept standing by someone else's money. Her approval didn't just flatter them, it paid bills. Because of my parents, I never really knew Claudia. She had always existed in family stories as a person to be handled carefully and approached only when invited. When I was in college and she sent a graduation gift, my mother told me not to call because she doesn't like emotional obligations. When Sylvie was born, I asked whether I should send an announcement, and my father said, "She's not interested in baby things." Once, years earlier, I had mentioned Claudia during Christmas dinner, and my mother shut it down with a quick, "Your aunt prefers distance." So I learned to leave the subject alone, the way children in certain families learn where not to step. By the time I was a grown woman and a single mother, the message had hardened into something uglier. Claudia, I was told, had no patience for struggling women, disliked disorder, and would not enjoy being around a child. I accepted that because it fit the version of her my parents seemed invested in maintaining: rich, polished, severe. A person who would see me and my daughter as proof of bad choices. That image kept me from reaching toward her even when it might have made sense to try. Distance felt pre-assigned. I believed them for years. The funny thing is, the evidence had always been second-hand. Nobody ever quoted Claudia directly in a full sentence. It was all interpretation, always filtered through my parents. "She's very modern about these things," my mother once said at a cousin's barbecue with the faint disapproval she used for women who were financially independent and not sorry. Another time I heard my father tell someone that Claudia believed women should be able to choose whether they had children at all, and he said it like he was reporting a character flaw. In our family, that became shorthand for something harsher. It turned into, "She doesn't like kids," then into, "Don't let children bother her," then into, "You know how Claudia is." I never stopped to separate the ideas because I was busy surviving my own life. There is a difference between respecting women who do not want motherhood and disliking children who already exist, but my parents collapsed that distinction on purpose. I should have questioned it sooner, but exhaustion makes borrowed stories feel official. It let them cast Claudia as aloof while sounding like guardians of normal family values. They turned a principle into a warning. When Claudia actually arrived, my parents' instructions to me became explicit enough to be humiliating. My mother caught me in the kitchen before breakfast and said, "Today, I need you to make yourself scarce." She said it with an apologetic smile that only made it worse because it tried to dress contempt as logistics. "Stay outside for a while if the weather holds. Don't hover. Don't let Sylvie run in and out. Claudia values peace." My father, standing by the coffee maker, added, "And keep the child from touching anything." The child. Not your daughter. Not your granddaughter. Just a category of inconvenience. I looked at the clock, at Sylvie eating toast at the counter, at the backpack of inhalers and wipes and snacks I had packed because living there had taught me always to have an exit bag ready. "She's 5, I said. "She's not a puppy." My mother's smile vanished. "Liana, please don't be difficult for one afternoon." So when Claudia's car pulled up, Sylvie and I were already in the yard with chalk, bubbles, and a blanket, positioned where my parents could say we were present but not disruptive. I hated agreeing to it. I hated how normal it was starting to feel. They assigned us to the yard. I stayed because leaving in anger would not have produced a better roof that night. That is the calculation dependency forces on you. Every sharp reply has to be measured against beds, meals, medication, gas money, and the 1,000 tiny things stability buys a child. Sylvie asked questions in the plain way children do. "Why can't we have tea too?" "Why do I have to use the side door?" "Does Grandpa not like cartoons?" Most of the time, I answered with soft lies that made adult cruelty sound like preference. "They're having grown-up company. We're helping by giving them space. Different houses have different rules." One evening, after my mother told Sylvie not to sing in the hallway because it echoed, Sylvie climbed onto the daybed and asked, "Are we bothering them by living here?" I sat beside her and fixed the blanket she didn't need fixing because I needed my hands busy. "We're just here for a little while," I said. Some days that choice felt adult. Some days it felt expensive. I swallowed my anger again because the repairs had an end date and because I knew direct confrontation only made my parents meaner in more polished ways. I kept picking the short-term peace. That afternoon, before the attack, the weather was clear enough for my mother to insist we stay outside from the moment the good plates came out. Sylvie and I sat on the side patio where the fence cast a thin stripe of shade across the concrete. I had a bottle of water, her inhaler, my phone, and the quiet, watchful posture that had become second nature in that house. Through the dining room window, I could hear a softer version of my mother than the one we got. Her hosting laugh floated out in bursts. My father carried a plate past the glass with the solemnity of a man escorting state documents. Sylvie blew bubbles and chased them for a few minutes, then switched to chalk because running too much made me nervous when pollen was high. She had started with a crooked rainbow and then tried to turn it into a cat that looked like a cloud, and I told her it was excellent, and for one brief stretch it almost felt manageable. Then she stopped drawing. She touched her chest. She coughed once, then again, and the sound came from deeper in her lungs than I wanted to hear. I reached for the inhaler before she asked for it. Then I heard the wheeze. Claudia moved with the kind of efficiency that makes panic around her reorganize itself. She took us straight through the front hall, not the side door my mother preferred for us, and opened the passenger side of her car before I even registered what kind it was. It was dark, expensive, and spotless. I snapped open Sylvie's folding booster in the back and buckled her in with hands that still shook. Claudia slid into the driver's seat, connected her phone to the dashboard, and said, "Nearest pediatric ER, fastest route." Only then did my father reach the porch and call out, "Claudia, this is being blown out of proportion." She didn't answer him. My mother came behind him, pale and furious in a way that suggested fear had finally found the correct address. Claudia lowered her window 2 inches. "No," she said, very evenly. "What's blown out of proportion is your confidence." Then she drove. On the way, she asked only useful questions. No lectures, no sympathy performance, just information. By the time we pulled under the emergency entrance awning, my parents were a shrinking blur in the mirror. She didn't ask them twice. The ER did what competence always does in a crisis. It made room for facts and pushed ego out of the way. A nurse took one look at Sylvie's breathing and brought us back quickly. There was a pulse ox clip, a nebulizer mask that made Sylvie look smaller than she was, a resident who listened carefully instead of theatrically, and a plastic cup of grape-flavored steroid medicine that Sylvie hated on principle. Claudia stayed because she had already decided she was staying. She held my bag when I needed both hands. She found tissues without asking where they were kept. By the time the second treatment ended, Sylvie's shoulders had dropped and the tight pull between her ribs had eased. We were still there for hours, but the hardest part had passed. Later, when Sylvie was curled beside me half asleep under a hospital blanket, Claudia sat in the molded plastic chair across from us and finally spoke about the thing my parents had turned into family folklore. "For the record," she said, "supporting women who choose not to become mothers is not the same thing as disliking children. What I dislike is cruelty pretending to be refinement." For the first time, I heard her in her own words. Once Sylvie stabilized enough for me to unclench, Claudia asked questions my parents had never invited. Where had we been staying exactly? How long had the repairs been going on? Why had I never called her when things got hard? That last question almost made me laugh, because from my side of the family story, the answer was obvious. "I thought you wanted distance," I said. "My parents always said you didn't want kids around, and that you especially didn't want me showing up with problems." Claudia stared at me for a full second, not offended, just stunned. "They told me the opposite," she said, "that you preferred to keep your life separate, that you thought I was judgmental, and that I should not intrude unless invited. They hardly mentioned Sylvie at all. I didn't even have your number anymore. Everything between us had always been routed through them." There it was, the empty space where a relationship should have been, explained in one efficient cut. We had not drifted apart naturally. We had been arranged apart. That was the design, and suddenly I could see it. Claudia told me she had asked, more than once over the years, whether I was doing all right, whether there was anything practical I needed, and had been told I valued independence too much to appreciate interference. They hadn't kept us apart by accident. They had managed that distance on purpose. By the time discharge papers were printed, Claudia had already decided. "You and Sylvie are coming home with me," she said. "Not for tonight. Home." I started to protest out of habit, but she cut across it. "Your daughter needs clean air and adults with judgment," she said. "I have both." At her house, less showy than my parents and far more comfortable, she put us in a real guest room, set fresh towels on the bed, and handed me a spare charger. Then she made 3 phone calls in the study with the door open. I heard enough to understand the outline, and later Claudia filled in the rest. The house my parents lived in was held through a family trust she controlled. The luxury car lease my father guarded like a crown jewel was paid through an account she funded. That night, she ended the monthly help. My parents reacted the same way people do when a private structure collapses under public light: outrage, blame, frantic revision. Their calls to Claudia went unanswered. The family group chat went very quiet after that. My parents' smear attempts died as soon as Claudia stated the facts to the family. Within weeks, the image they had protected cracked all the way through. Sylvie and I stayed where emergencies were treated like emergencies, and that has remained enough. After what my parents did when my daughter could barely breathe, was I right to cut them off completely? Or should I have given them one last chance to stay in our lives? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories.
Hi, a quick hello from Zoraida. Let me know what you thought about the story. And also, if you would like to listen to me narrating my own stories and also performing some of it, then please check out my other channel. There should be a link in the description and probably somewhere on the screen.